Hello, everybody. I just wanted to thank again the organizers of this conference and for accepting my paper. This is my first time at an academic conference, so I'm excited to give it a shot. Yeah. And as we get started, to kind of lay out what the point of this paper is, and for reference, this is very much legally oriented around specific doctrines that are prevalent across the world, but focusing on the US. And the impetus for my presentation was actually the rise in unsheltered homelessness in the United States. So specifically people that are homeless, that do not have access to someone's couch or even like a car to sleep in. And so what we're seeing in the United States and to some extent across the world, as we all well know, with respect to increased housing prices and decreased supply, that this issue is really becoming pretty intractable in the US. So unlike rent control, that's very much at the beginning of this sort of question of homeownership and access to secure housing, my paper really focuses on the people that are left out of the system and what cities, states, and their neighbors do to help manage the situation, support them, or exclude them, which is what we find in this particular use of public nuisance. And I will explain what public nuisance is, please don't worry. But functionally, what we're seeing here is that there are laws declaring that sleeping outside, and specifically sleeping in like settlements, informal settlements, are being really implemented in the United States at an increasing rate. And there are discussions in the UK about rough sleeping as well. And it seems like just a big problem. And now we're even seeing private parties suing governments for allowing an informal settlement to exist while they're building more affordable housing. So that's kind of the setup of the problem. And the main question that I'm trying to answer is, how did this phenomenon of using public nuisance law to address impoverished people that are living in informal settlements come about? And what are the problems with that? And what does it kind of tell us about the role of the state in dealing with housing issues, as well as what we do as members of the community when our fellow neighbors lose their housing? Because most unsheltered homeless people in the US stay unsheltered and live in encampments where they became homeless. So they really are our neighbors. And so the answer is that, at least that I have found and what I propose, is that public nuisance law is actually now being used as a doctrinal substitute for vagrancy law. So don't worry, I will explain all of those. I know not everybody here is a lawyer. So here's a little primer on American nuisance law. And basically what nuisance law is it deals with interferences. The specific definition from the US restatement of like civil law is an unreasonable interference with a right common to the general public. So what we're thinking here normally, like the typical kind of paradigmatic examples of public nuisance are somebody is spilling oil all over a river that is used for navigation or fishing, and therefore that affects the public's right. Every single public member of their, oh no. Okay, then it affects every person's right to navigate or fish in that lake. Another example is something like building a wall in the middle of a highway, which interferes with the public's right to travel. So we're not talking about private rights here. It's supposed to be larger kinds of rights that are available to everybody in their capacity as a member of the public. And so it's really a property-focused doctrine. And so what we're seeing now is cities either applying public nuisance law to disband and basically just kind of shove away or functionally banish unsheltered folks. And we also have seen, and this is the biggest evolution in the legal doctrine here, private parties, so neighbors, suing the city for allowing an existing settlement of people. Yes, and this kind of claim is actually something that has happened internationally. I've been able to find evidence of this sort of claim in Ireland, South Africa, India, a little bit in Australia, all kinds of different places. Yeah, even though I have not done a formal survey. So this is something that's going to be relevant moving forward, it seems like, at least based on what's going on now. And now we get into the twin of public nuisance law, which is vagrancy law. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with that. It is something that has been largely international, but basically vagrancy law was originated after the Black Death killed a bunch of people, and there weren't very many laborers, right? And so the government responded at that time during the feudal era by basically making it illegal and qualifying someone as a vagrant if they were wandering without a home and without a job. So it's basically the origin of at least the like Western kind of criminalization of poverty and lack of shelter. And we actually can see that these doctrines have a lot in common, and I'm not going to get into these specific commonalities, but functionally speaking, the paper argues that they are twins of one another and have elements of largely just considerations of order and disorder, what belongs in public, what doesn't belong in public, right? Because a lot of the vagrancy laws were basically saying you don't have a right to be somewhere or in public if you are poor and unsheltered and a fiscal burden on our community. So that's kind of the backdrop here. And in the US, specifically, vagrancy law was found unconstitutional in the 1970s. So just flat out, it had been a very popular thing for a very long time, and it was found out flat unconstitutional. And so since then, the US has unfortunately decreased its investment in public housing, in housing support in general, across the board. And so cities have been left with an increasing homelessness problem, specifically unsheltered homelessness, like we were talking about earlier, but they aren't able to use their catch-all tool, which I think is a good thing, of vagrancy law. And what we've seen slowly over the past 40 years has been a shift towards a much more property-focused, because it feels more neutral, right? Oh, I'm not moving you because you're poor, I'm moving you because you're urinating outside, or because you don't have anywhere else to go, right? So it's been a switch to what is perceived to be a more objective kind of status or objective conduct rather than status. But what happens when we put this property-based framework around a group of people who canonically do not own real property in the sense of having a classical home or even a lease, it really kind of brings to light a lot of important questions about the state and the role of us and other actors on how to deal with this extra issue when things like rent control or subsidies don't catch everybody. And we see that they don't. So this has led to some really interesting kinds of results. In the US, we have a couple of really prominent ongoing cases related to this. And some of them have found the government liable, because what we've seen is not only cities who have kind of like seeing like a state and seeing like a city that I believe another professor referenced yesterday. Really what we're looking at here is kind of the incentives of a city and what they are going to do in response to something like this. And typically what we've seen is that they go for fast, easy solutions that keep people out of sight and keep the public not complaining, right? Because that's one of the huge things here. It's a visibility. The visibility of poverty and a lack of housing makes people uncomfortable. And so cities are very prone to just try to disperse people and make the problem less visible. But it doesn't actually solve it. We've had a rotating kind of issue with this since, frankly, at least the 1300s. And so what we see here too is that even in cities where they are more willing to allow people to exist and on land somewhere, usually city land, those cities now are actually being targeted by wealthier homeowners and business owners in the area by actually using the same doctrine that other states have written into the public nuisance laws that criminalize camping, are now actually using them against cities. And we've seen actually now 2 or 3 successful cases in the US, and there have been other successful cases in other countries. So this is becoming a really serious issue that we actually have to resolve. Now, I am not going to get into the doctrinal problems here, but I think we're going to kind of end here on some of these practical and normative problems. And because ultimately what this paper argues is that public nuisance is not the correct framework to respond to this problem with. But analyzing these problems through the lens of public nuisance draws in fundamental questions of who is a member of the public, how should the public respond when people are confronted with situations that are, frankly, dangerous and unsanitary and unsafe, largely for the members of the encampments themselves. But so it raises a lot of these kinds of questions about what the role the state is supposed to have here. How are there ways in which we are actually perpetuating and dehumanizing people when we talk about these issues through what is perceived to be a more objective lens of public nuisance while ignoring the on-the-ground realities. Because what happens in these lawsuits is that usually the people that are unsheltered themselves aren't really involved. In a case where the city of Phoenix in Arizona, where I'm from, was sued by private property owners nearby, the individuals, there were about like 800 to 1,000 individuals in an informal settlement, and not a single one of them was ever consulted at any point, even though the entire court remedy that they provided was the removal and moving physically of these folks. And so I think with this kind of really part of why I think this is very important, in addition to the fact that this seems like a phenomenon that's increasing across the world, is that it really does raise these fundamental questions of what we do with issues of housing and what role the state really has. And so ultimately, because I reject the application of this specific doctrine, the paper kind of ends on a note of encouraging the thinking about ways we can restructure this problem. What this kind of framework can tell us about communities and governments. And so I, propose a couple of stopgap solutions here, but I would really love for anybody's thoughts on what this kind of framing might bring to mind and different ways that we think this highlights the role of the state in actually addressing these kinds of issues, because it is a problem for the people living in the settlements. It's not safe or healthy, right? But there's something, when we don't have enough housing, what do you do, right? And to me, the answer cannot be just ignore and hide people, but I also don't really have a better one. And so that's kind of it. I won't go through the specific solutions because they are very much related to constitutional claims and different kinds of things that nobody wants to learn about substantive due process right now. But yeah, so that's the paper. And if anybody has any questions, please let me know. But yeah, functionally, I think this is going to be an increasing problem. And so I hope that we can kind of get started early on in tackling this and maybe using this framework, as distorted as it might be, to raise better questions and better answers about what we do with our community members. Thank you.